Welcome to the second session of the 4+2 Diabetes Reversal Strategy. Today, we're going to learn how to eat to lower insulin. And this is the first step in the 4+2 Diabetes Reversal Strategy. So why do we eat? We eat to provide nutrients required for energy, for growth, and for maintenance. And if you were to remember nothing else from what we're saying, the key message I'm going to drive home here is the importance of whole foods or minimally processed foods, foods that are still encased within the cells from which they grow. And in many ways, this is the shortcut. You could just learn this and take this home and eat whole food diet, and you would be 90% of the way home. But let's go through a bit more of the explanation around the nutrition. So food is, when we think about food, we think about macronutrients, right? So food is made up of fat, it's made up of protein, and it's made up of carbohydrates, right? So those are the three macronutrients that provide the energy. Food also has a whole lot more to it in terms of micronutrients and other things that we need, not so much for energy, but for certainly for growth and maintenance. And also to drive our energy system. So we shouldn't negate that, as sometimes we just talk about food from an energy perspective. So when we eat food, our food breaks down into units that can be absorbed in the blood. So fats break down into fatty acids, and proteins break down into amino acids, and carbohydrates break down into glucose. So these are the units that can kind of be absorbed in our blood and used. The carbohydrates, really there are three kinds, so starches, sugars, and fiber. And I like to kind of break them down into really simple or complex. And simple carbohydrates are those that break down into glucose very easily, and complex take either longer to break down or, in fact, like fiber, don't break down at all. And the key kind of here from an insulin resistance standpoint is their effect on insulin. So if the sugars and starches break down very quickly to glucose, the pancreas is going to have to release insulin in order to control the blood sugar, just simply put. If they take a long time to break down or they don't actually get absorbed, then the effect on insulin is negligible. And insulin, of course, is the hormone. It's the storage hormone. And so insulin is triggered by the presence of glucose. So when we eat sugar or carbohydrate, we absorb it as glucose, and that absorption into the bloodstream from the small intestine stimulates the pancreas to release the insulin, right? And so the pancreas wants to keep the blood sugar very tightly controlled, because remember, the glucose in too high level is toxic. So insulin's going to act on the body cells, especially kind of the key ones that we've gone through in the introduction, the liver, fat, and muscle, to help absorb glucose, but it also does drive kind of the absorption of fatty acids and amino acids. And the insulin acts to store glucose as glycogen. It stores fatty acids as fat and fat tissue, and it takes amino acids and helps the building of proteins. And while it's doing that, it's also stopping the breakdown of previously stored glycogen, fat, or protein. And so kind of bottom line is insulin is a storage hormone. So anything that triggers insulin triggers a storage situation. This is our single teaspoon of glucose, which represents the amount of sugar that is circulating in the blood, right? So 5.5 millimoles per liter, kind of a normal fasting blood sugar, is the equivalent of 1 teaspoon of sugar. Not very much. So one of the things in your presentation in the session this week in the materials, there is an infographic that takes a bunch of common foods and really kind of converts them to sugar equivalents. And so what we've done is kind of equate them to teaspoons of sugar. And the point here is really to drive home that each, if you think about, if there's only a teaspoon of sugar circulating in the blood, then things that have lots of teaspoons of sugar are going to generate quite an insulin response. So, the basmati rice example that we gave is, look, there's the 10 teaspoons of sugar. Wow, okay. Cranberry juice, 12.5 teaspoons of sugar. The cornflakes, 7.3 teaspoons of sugar. Or my all-time favorite, the pancake, 1 6-inch pancake, 14 teaspoons of sugar equivalent. That's a ton of glucose coming in. It's going to release and require a lot of insulin. And in insulin resistance, the problem is too much insulin, and the first step of the strategy is to eat to reduce the insulin requirements. So anything that triggers insulin, we want to decrease. We want to eat in such a way that we don't trigger as much insulin. So compare kind of some of these things when you kind of look at, steel cut oats, 2.3 teaspoons, right? And you think about the absorption of those steel cut oats. Um, if the liver kind of needs to produce about 2 teaspoons of glucose per hour in order to maintain that 1 teaspoon of glucose that's kind of in the blood at all times, then the oatmeal, if it takes about an hour to be absorbed, is not going to do very much to insulin, right, compared to that pancake. Fruits. We always get asked about fruits in the diabetes reversal. What about fruits? Look at the strawberries. Look at the berries. Really are not a factor. An orange or an apple, again, kind of 1.8 or 2.2 teaspoons of sugar equivalent. And when you think about the absorption of that over time, probably not much of an issue, right? Where we have to watch are things with, added sugar or refined or processed carbohydrates, and we'll talk about that. So the refined carbohydrates really, I think, in many respects, are kind of our modern curse, right? And so this is since we've had a food industry, we've developed this notion of refined carbohydrates. And so, look at this, the definition, right? Processed, extracted, concentrated, purified, transformed enzymatically from natural whole foods. From things that we could eat in their natural form, we've processed, extracted, concentrated, purified, transformed them enzymatically. We've done a lot of things that actually end up making these carbohydrates just get absorbed incredibly quickly. And so they get converted to glucose quickly, absorbed quickly, and then they generate a massive insulin response, which worsens insulin resistance. So with these, clearly if we're going to eat to lower insulin, we've got to get rid of the refined carbohydrates. And so we want to push out the refined carbohydrates, and we want to have whole foods. And the whole food carbohydrates have a lot less impact on our insulin. Fiber comes with the whole food carbohydrates, and this is key. So fiber, we often kind of think about fiber in terms of decreasing and slowing the absorption, which it absolutely does, right? So that's the difference between, having a glass of orange juice, which gets absorbed very, very quickly, or eating an orange, which takes time to be absorbed because essentially the same stuff, but the fiber, it takes a while to break it down. It takes a while to break down the orange, and the fiber just slows the absorption of the glucose, and it blunts the insulin response, so we don't get as much insulin released. But fiber also is a food for our healthy bacteria. So we have bacteria in our gut, and some people call it our second genome. So a second set of genes that we have is all these bacteria, running around in our body, and these bacteria are really, really good for us, or some of the bacteria are very, very good for us. So bacteria will take fiber and it'll turn it into short-chain fatty acids, SCFA. So these short-chain fatty acids and the effect on the body are really quite miraculous. So if we're eating enough fiber and we've got good bacteria in our gut, that is going to lead to these short-chain fatty acids circulating. And the short-chain fatty acids actually bind to receptors in the colon and fat cells to affect all, I should also say, bind to the receptors in the brain, bind to and affect all of the major hunger hormones. So short-chain fatty acids will increase PYY. And so this is the satiation hormone. So this is the hormone that, after you eat, sends a signal to the brain, hey, we're done. Released by the intestine and kind of working on the hypothalamus, that kind of little orange area in the brain there. Short-chain fatty acids will decrease ghrelin, right? So our hunger hormone. So this is the hormone that when you get incredibly hungry, that's ghrelin. And short-chain fatty acids will help decrease that. So it decreases that hunger drive. And over the longer term, short-chain fatty acids increase the production of leptin. And leptin is key in terms of maintaining kind of our overall appetite, but also base metabolic rate. And it works, again, in that little orange area, the hypothalamus in the brain. So short-chain fatty acids, incredibly important to help with our hunger hormones. They also help with fat metabolism, right? So they will help create a situation where essentially they will increase our ability to burn fat. So we want to be able to burn fat. So they increase our ability to burn fat in the liver, muscle, and fat tissue. So they'll actually get rid of some of the fat that's in the cells causing insulin resistance. they'll decrease the synthesis of new fat, and they also decrease fat storage. And so this will all result in decreasing free fatty acid circulation in the blood. So remember, the fat that we see kind of spilling over from the fat cells and going back to the liver, causing liver fat and insulin resistance there, the short chain fatty acids are going to help. And so fiber going into the bacteria, the gut bacteria, getting turned into short chain fatty acids are going to help with our fat metabolism. The key with fiber is 30 grams of fiber per day. And this is not a lot. It's actually, very achievable if you're eating, five, 5+ servings of fruit and veg a day. If you're eating beans and legumes, if you're eating nuts, if you're eating healthy whole grains. And so this is a key. The hard part with this is probably only 10% of the population is getting 30 grams of fiber per day. 90% of the population is not. So when we look at carbohydrates, our bottom line is, first, avoid the refined carbs. Think sugar equivalents. Think what it's going to do in terms of an insulin response. There's just no place in our diet for these refined carbohydrates. They are a modern curse, and we really just need to work to eliminate them. Eat as many veggies as possible. You can eat unlimited veg. You're hungry, go back and eat veg. Get as much fiber as possible. So 30 grams is kind of the target, but you can go well beyond 30 grams. And watch the starchy carbs that are low in fiber, right? So the basmati rice is, it's a real food, but it's been processed and it no longer has the fiber with it. And so it, as we've seen, will generate that insulin response. So watch the starchy carbs that are low in fiber. Fat. So fat is kind of cool, as we said in the introduction, in the sense that when you eat it, it gets absorbed through the lymphatic channels, right? From the intestine, and then goes directly into the systemic blood flow. It doesn't go through the liver, right? So the fat kind of gets distributed first. So it's available to cells for energy, and some cells prefer it as energy. So the heart, the intestine, and actually muscle at rest prefers fat as its fuel. And fat, though, if insulin levels are high, and we're going to come at this when we look at processed food, but if insulin levels are high, so if you're eating fat with a bunch of carbohydrate that's generated insulin, that fat's actually going to end up getting just stored. So insulin helps store fat in fat tissue. So fat's the complicated one, right? So fat's, this I think a lot of people have trouble kind of keeping it straight and what's good fat and what's bad fat. And I think we've made it too complex in many ways from an understanding standpoint. But let's go through it a little bit. So saturated fats are, there are no double bonds between the carbons. It's, one way to think about it, kind of solid at room temperature, mainly from meat. Question about being healthy or unhealthy. Another area I think about is dairy. I'll come back to that kind of question of whether saturated fats are healthy or unhealthy. Unsaturated fats have one or more double bonds, and they're liquid at room temperature. And then you've got kind of polyunsaturated, which just have multiple double bonds, or monounsaturated, which have a single double bond. The monounsaturated, we tend to think about the heart-healthy fats, right? So the fats that predominate in the Mediterranean diet, so the olive oil and avocado. Fats are essential, right? So we need to eat the omega fats because we can't make them, right? Carbohydrates, interestingly, are not essential. We can live without eating carbohydrate. We cannot live without eating the omega fats, and likewise there are proteins. The 9 essential amino acids. We have to eat them. We can't make them. But so the essential fatty acids, the omegas, are super important. So we have to eat these, and the simplistic view is omega-6s are the pro-inflammatory and the omega-3s are the anti-inflammatory. But I think it all comes down to the balance between the omega-3s and the omega-6s. We actually do need both of them, right? So it's not that we don't need the omega-6s. The problem is in kind of the SAD diet, or the standard American diet, which has become kind of the SAD diet for the whole world, is the balance is tipped way, way over. So 25-1 omega-6s to omega-3s, right? Some people argue that if you look kind of from an evolutionary perspective, Paleolithic man maybe was getting a 1-to-1 ratio, and I think more people argue that probably somewhere kind of around 4-to-1. So omega-6s will probably still predominate, but 4-to-1 omega-6s to omega-3s is probably the right balance there. And so really what we see is in kind of modern diets, we often have to think about getting our omega-3s, and we don't really have to think about getting the omega-6s. They're just kind of ubiquitous. And so, if we think about getting our omega-3s and we kind of watch where we're getting the polyunsaturated fats for the omega-6s, we usually land in kind of a healthy ratio. Um, Short chain versus long chain. So, when we look at the omega-3s, ALA is the short chain, and it's actually the one that's essential. If we get enough ALA, we can convert it to EPA and DHA, the two longer chain omega-3s. And the trouble is many of us aren't very good at that conversion, right? So a lot of people are very, very inefficient at converting ALA into DHA and EPA. And so this is really where we say supplement fish oils, and it doesn't have to be fish oils, right? It can actually be oil from algae, because the fish actually get the oil from algae in the first place. So it can be algae oil, but we need to get the omega-3s. You can get it from eating fish. The challenge is just, can you get enough of it? How much fish do you need to eat? How sustainable is that? What else is in the fish, right? So we often have to worry about kind of heavy metals with some of the fish. And so often, I generally recommend for most people that they supplement with an omega-3. I think we're just not getting enough omega-3s. We'll talk, we'll often get questions about, well, what about flax and flaxseed and flaxseed oil? Kind of plant-derived omega-3s, just and very good source of the short chain, right? So absolutely can use it to produce your ALA. The question is, can you get enough in order to convert into the DHA and EPA? And you don't really know. And one of the things that you can do is you can actually get a blood test called the Omega Index, which will look at your red blood cells. It'll look at the membranes of your red blood cells, and it'll tell you if you've got a healthy amount of omega, the omega-3s versus 6s in the membrane, where it really counts. And this is where these fats have their action in our bodies. So you can do that. It's a test that it's not super expensive, but it is a few $100s. So that can be kind of an approach to guide supplementation, or you can just simply supplement. And most people in our programs will end up supplementing. This is kind of more of a shortcut to start thinking about, like, well, what's the healthy fat balance? And so really kind of if you looked at the natural storage of fats for people when they're eating a healthy diet and are at a normal weight and are active, so just basically very healthy people, their fat tends to get stored about 55% as monounsaturated fat, 20% as polyunsaturated fat, and 30% as the 30% is the saturated fat, so 20% polyunsaturated. And so the bulk, kind of your go-to in terms of oils, ends up being kind of olive and avocado oils, and then obviously eating olives and avocados for sure, and getting kind of over half of your fat calories there. On the polyunsaturated fats, eating kind of nuts, seeds, fish oil, kind of getting a good balance between omega-3s and omega-6s. And then kind of the remainder, healthy meats, dairy, coconut oil. And really kind of here, the only time I worry about saturated, if people are eating in this kind of balance, the only time I worry about the saturated fat is in regards to their LDL cholesterol and their overall risk from a heart disease perspective. And so, in our view, kind of getting the nutrition right, getting the shift to whole foods, getting kind of a good fat balance. Different people thrive at different levels of fat in their diet. And so I'll often kind of guide them from the basis of, kind of making these shifts first, and then just seeing, on a cholesterol panel, where does their LDL cholesterol come out? What is their overall risk? Are we concerned about it? Are there some tweaks that we can make to shift from maybe some saturated to some monounsaturated, and just kind of work at that level? So saturated fats can certainly be part of a healthy diet, and the saturated fats themselves, what we see with them is kind of conflicting evidence whether saturated fat levels in the diet cause heart disease, right? And so the case has been made that saturated fats in the diet increase LDL cholesterol, and LDL cholesterol is associated with heart disease. But the case has never been made around saturated fats themselves directly being causal for heart disease. And I think there's just more factors to it. So, really kind of when you land in this balance, the reality is you're probably not eating a ton of saturated fat. And I think what will happen is we can also guide based on kind of personal risk factors at a closer level and a more individualized level than looking at just kind of a standard recommendation. Protein. So when you look at protein, protein is not really a preferred energy source, preferred source for energy, right? So protein we eat to make other proteins. So build muscle, make the other proteins. If we look at kind of most of the useful molecules in our bodies are proteins, right? So neurotransmitters, enzymes, hormones, receptors, they're all proteins. And so there's always a little bit of turnover, so we can break down our own proteins and recycle them. But there's always a bit of turnover where things get broken. So we need to have a certain amount of protein coming in per day in order just to allow for this growth and maintenance. So remember when we talked about food, we said we eat for energy, but we also eat for growth and maintenance, right? So protein is really key in the growth and maintenance department. And there are 9 essential amino acids, so we have to eat them, right? We have to, your diet has to have these. And so, when we think about protein, the first question I always get is, well, how much? How much protein should I have? And protein's kind of fascinating. It's one of the most talked about aspects in all of our kind of nutrition. In our nutritional programs, people are always asking about protein, and people are always wondering, are they getting enough protein? So you look at the official answer. Between 10 and 35% of our daily caloric intake, or 8 grams per kilogram per day, is the recommended RDA set in both Canada and the US. So you kind of go, okay, well, let's try to figure this out. And so, sorry, that should be 0.8. So protein, how much? If we take those kind of things and start to break down, we say, okay, well, what about for an 80 kilogram male or a 60 kilogram female? So let's break down the base requirements and take that 0.8 grams per kilogram and put it in place. What does that turn out to be? How much is that? And then let's look at different activity levels and kind of the research and evidence around what amounts of protein you need for these different activity levels. Essentially, they're supporting muscle. And you do all this work, you do all this mathematics, and what you find out is that it ranges somewhere between 10 and 17% of the caloric intake needs to be from protein. And then you go and take a look and you look at the average Canadian intake of protein is 17%. So the average Canadian is eating like they're a strength or power athlete, right? So, and you look at the studies where, 97% of Canadians get enough protein. Maybe 3% don't. So really kind of where I land on this is your diet probably has enough protein, right? So stop thinking about the quantity of the protein and think about the quality of the protein. And so, and really here, I sort of land on kind of this notion of let's build our meals around kind of quality whole food protein packages, and you'll easily meet your daily protein needs, and it's going to provide very good satiation because protein does help with satiation. And if we kind of look for the added bonuses that come in the protein packages, so if we're choosing something that has protein that also has fiber, that's going to maximize satiation. Or the protein's got omega-3s, that's going to help as well. So kind of look at it from that perspective. And in the handouts for this session, there's a little infographic with 20 healthy protein packages, kind of all different types of protein, both plant and animal, but also kind of details how much protein's there, but what's with the protein, and gives you some examples of how to get kind of enough protein. So really kind of here, let's not worry about supplements. Let's not worry about taking extra protein because you're probably getting enough. Let's think about the overall food quality and what else comes with that protein. Are there benefits to having more protein? Well, so extra dietary protein, if it's above and beyond the needs for growth, maintenance, and repair, and the most that we ever see there is that 1.6 grams per kilogram in strength and power athletes. So, and that doesn't correlate with a lot of protein, to tell you the truth. So most people are going to get enough protein, and then if we're already kind of at or above our caloric threshold, so our energy threshold, any extra dietary protein will get converted to fat. Now, the conversion isn't quite efficient, right? So some of those calories are actually lost in the conversion. So some people argue that that's a smart reason to eat more protein. Um, and extra protein increases satiation, right? So if you eat more protein, well, and actually, bottom line, it's hard to eat more protein, right? So bodybuilders have a heck of a time getting more protein in, and that's why they kind of resort to putting these, big supplement into their smoothie, right? They take a big scoop of protein powder and try to hide it in their smoothie to get more protein. Um, so protein does help with satiation. So one of the key tips with protein is make sure your meals all have enough protein, right? So, don't have, and this is kind of a classic mistake that people will make is having a breakfast that just doesn't have enough protein in it. So make sure that you break your fast, kind of first meal that you kind of break your fast in the morning, that you got enough protein in there, at least 20 to 30 grams of protein. And this actually, has been shown to decrease the ghrelin. That's that hunger hormone. And so it'll decrease the ghrelin. So if you start with a meal that actually has enough protein, you get enough satiation, you won't tend to overeat in the next meal that you have. Um, is there harm from eating too much protein? And so, previously people would say, yes, the kidneys are going to be damaged by too much protein. I just don't think the evidence supports that. And so I don't think there is harm from eating too much protein. And besides, I think it's actually really hard to eat too much protein. Your brain doesn't want to do that. Um, so the protein, extra protein is just going to end up being fat. So, I guess that's the harm of it. Um, there are some longevity theories definitely about protein. And so there are theories that, not eating, keeping protein levels pretty low is associated with longevity. I'm not 100% convinced on that evidence, and I don't think people need to guide their lives based on that. And I think the bottom line is our brains actually regulate protein pretty well, as we'll see in a moment. And so I think the key question is really kind of what accompanies the protein. Is it healthy fat, fiber, or is it saturated fat? And is saturated fat an issue for you? So I think that's kind of what you need to think about when you're looking at your protein source. Plant versus animal. So this one's very topical. Lots on this. Bottom line is, I don't think there's any fundamental difference between eating meat or eating a variety of vegetable sources of protein in terms of getting your essential amino acids. Now, meat's kind of considered a complete protein because all of those essential amino acids are in the meat. Whereas with the plant sources, you tend to have to eat a variety. But in terms, the breakdown of those complete proteins is into amino acids exactly the same. There is some evidence kind of with weightlifters and power athletes that there's better muscle buildup on, with whey protein versus plant-derived protein. But I don't, again, that there's probably individual variations. You can kind of see for yourself if you're supplementing and trying to use it that way. But I think when we're talking kind of in this context around diabetes reversal, I really don't think there's a difference in terms of the quality of protein for the people in this circumstance. So there are other factors for sure here, and there's the environmental factors, there is the sustainability factors, there's the ethical factors, and those I think are kind of individuals, right? It's individual things. So each of us needs to make our own choice about, is it ethical to eat animals? Is it ethical the way the animals are raised? Is it sustainable from our environmental perspective? And so kind of in our programs, I don't tend to step in there too much. Really kind of guide people that the reality is most people could probably benefit from eating a few more plant-based meals regardless, from just pure health perspective and in terms of trying to get enough fiber. So that's kind of where I land is there's no real difference in, from just a pure kind of amino acids getting into the body perspective. There's certainly some other factors to consider. And then, you look at kind of what comes in the protein packages, and the plants tend to have a little bit more to offer in what comes with the protein package. So the bottom line for protein, from my perspective and our perspective here in the 4+2 program, is plan your meals around healthy protein packages, right? So you don't really need to worry overall about quantity, think the quality, and look for fiber, because remember, 97% of Canadians get enough protein, yet only 10% of Canadians get enough fiber. So one of the ways that we could kind of fix this is if more Canadians had plant-based meals where they're getting the fiber from the plant sources of protein. Now, let's go and look at ultra-processed foods. This does not look yummy. This looks awful. So ultra-processed foods. So here's a definition for you. Formulations mostly of cheap industrial sources of dietary energy and nutrients plus additives using a series of processes and containing minimal whole foods. That doesn't sound very appetizing to me, right? So ultra processed foods, I think, are really, so related to the refined carbohydrates, which is an ultra processed food, obviously. I think this is one of the big problems and big drivers of that diabetes epidemic that we're seeing. And I think the ultra processed foods are at the heart of the problem. So let's look at what's in it, these ultra processed foods. So they're high in refined carbs. And so as we saw and talked about earlier, refined carbs will spike insulin. And insulin will kind of result in the refined carbs being stored immediately, right? So refined carbs will get broken down into glucose. It's going to get absorbed and stored immediately. They're high in fats. They tend to be high in cheap fats. So vegetable oils that are inflammatory because of the way they're processed. Very high in omega-6. So this is a big reason why we see this imbalance between omega-6s and 3s. And then high also in saturated fat. And so you're not getting kind of any monounsaturated fats here, and you're not getting kind of any omega-3s here. And then in combination with that high insulin level that you're going to get from the refined carbs, the fats are going to get stored immediately. So remember, right? The insulin is a storage hormone. High levels of insulin, you're also going to store fat. They're high in calories because they have both a large amount of carbs and fat, and they're low in fiber, right? So that's the reason they get absorbed so quickly, right? There's not a lot of fiber there, so they get broken down very quickly and stored very quickly. And then just to kind of drive the craving, they're high in salt. And so if you were going to design a food to lead to energy overload, it would look a lot like our ultra-processed food. If you were going to design a food that leads to insulin resistance, it looks like ultra-processed food or fast food, junk food, right? And so this is kind of the really sad state of affairs, right? Almost 50% of the total calories consumed by Canadians are ultra-processed. 31% greater likelihood for obesity, 37% greater likelihood for diabetes, 60% greater likelihood for hypertension. And so this is kind of, this food is just driving, all of these chronic diseases in our society. And this is really why I think we're seeing this epidemic of insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes. So, the bottom line is the ultra processed foods are really driving a lot more risk than they're worth. One of the most fascinating studies that I've seen is this study by Kevin Hall looking at ultra processed versus whole foods. And so this was kind of 20 subjects in a metabolic ward where they kind of measured everything, right? So they could really be precise in terms of what was happening to these people. Eat as much as you want. So they weren't limited in terms of calories. And it was a crossover. So people were their own controls. So they did 14 days on one diet, one kind of eating style, and 14 days on the other eating style. So half the group started with 14 days of eating the ultra-processed food, then switching over to 14 days of eating whole foods. And the other started with whole foods, and it's crossed over after 14 days to the ultra-processed. And look at this, right? During the time that people were eating the ultra processed foods. Remember, these people were their own controls, right? So this is compared to them when they're eating different food, the whole foods. So compared to, whole foods, they ate 500 calories per day more. If you start thinking about that, it's like, okay, 500 calories times 7 is 3,500 calories, which is about a pound of fat in terms of storage, right? And kind of over a year, that could be like 52 pounds, right? So, um, clearly they overate because of this. And look where they overate. Kind of almost even between fat and carbs, but protein was the same. So back to my point on protein, there's something in our brain that seems to regulate protein. And so we tend to eat as much protein as we need. We tend to actually kind of somehow regulate the protein regardless of the food quality we're eating. Our issue ends up being fat and carbs. And again, think about it. Fat and carbs are what our body really goes to for energy. Protein is there for, you know, building growth maintenance requirements. It's not really kind of eaten for energy. So our brains seem to be designed to overeat foods that, from an energy perspective. And so we overeat the fat and we overeat the carbs and that 500 calories per day. So you can see on an ultra processed diet how we would get to energy overload. And remember, the definition of diabetes that we're using is really this energy overload concept. And we're in energy overload, and we cannot compensate. We cannot no longer buffer it with our buffers. On the whole food diet, we see some of the benefits that we saw from the fiber, right? So increases in appetite suppressing hormone PYY. So there's the PYY, that's the satiation hormone. Decreases in ghrelin, right? So more satiation from less hunger from ghrelin. And we see fasting glucose go down. Yes, because back to that point, it's not generating, it's not spiking our glucose, and our insulin is more than able to cover it. Decreased insulin levels, decreased insulin resistance. And so remember, these people were their own controls. So just a fascinating study, kind of really pointing out the difference between an ultra processed diet and a whole food diet, and kind of the effects. So if we're going to put all this together and give you guys a strategy, what we want to do is well, we want to start by eating whole foods, right? So I keep coming back to this, right? So again, if you take nothing else from this and just think about eating whole foods, right? Not packaged foods, foods that are in their original cellular package that they're grown with, and not kind of broken down by factories. So if you eat whole foods, you're probably 90% of the way home. So start with the healthy protein package. For women, this could be kind of a palm-sized portion. For men, maybe two palm-sized portions. But again, remember, protein, you're probably going to regulate pretty well. Add veggies, fruits, legumes, whole grains. And really, you can go to town on the veggies and legumes. And the whole grains, the only thing to watch is just the degree, high starch whole grains. Again, it's the fiber that's with them, right? So you may have to watch that a little bit. But women two fist-sized portions, men four fist-sized portions. You're hungry, go back for more legumes. Healthy fats, right? Thumb-sized portions. One or two. Again, kind of taste or satiation will help you here. And again, if it's that mixture of kind of the healthy fats in the proportions we talked about, you're not going to get in trouble. Avoid the ultra processed foods. So think about the sugar equivalents in that. So really avoid that. Only drink the calories you love, and maybe the corollary to this is learn to love water. And here, what you're really seeing is that when you drink your calories, it really does kind of bypass your hunger and appetite control mechanisms. It's like you just threw extra calories on board compared to when you eat. Stop eating at 80% full. So this actually relates back to PYY. So PYY is released by the intestine, right? So as you eat, it takes about 20 minutes for the signal to get to your brain that you're full. Now, many of us are, doing the dishes by 20 minutes in, right? So we eat too quickly. And one of the thoughts about the French paradox in terms of people in France having low rates of obesity despite eating kind of high fat and rich foods is they eat actually very slowly in a social manner. But I think kind of you could just take this, definitely eat slower for sure, but stop at 80% full, because chances are at 80% full, if you wait 20 minutes, you'll actually feel completely full. And so this will stop you from overeating. And again, it'll allow you to help regulate kind of how much you're eating, and you'll feel better. And then 12 hours plus without eating. And so this is really kind of this notion, our bodies are designed to, really kind of from a biological perspective, we're designed to move and eat during the day, and we're designed to essentially recover, rest, and not eat during the night. And so kind of roughly a 12-hour balance, I think, is probably a pretty good one in order to get to the place where for 12 hours a day, there's no incoming food. And it also accentuates fat burning, right? So as the food from our kind of meals gets delivered, then our body, once it's metabolically flexible, can actually just start to burn fat as well. So it'll rely on glucose and glycogen from the liver, but it'll also rely more on fat burning. So the other thing, of course, this does is it stops nighttime snacking, which again kind of is kind of one of the more common behavioral reasons for energy overload. So if we do all of this, we actually accomplish a bunch of goals from a kind of the eat to lower insulin perspective. We definitely will decrease our insulin requirements, so kind of low carbohydrate or slow carbohydrate, doesn't carbohydrates that don't generate that insulin response. Will help reverse the energy overload, really kind of some of the food effect on our hunger hormones. So protein for satiation, fiber effects on hunger, restoring our fat burning. So eating healthy fats helps with fat burning, as does the time restricted eating, kind of going that 12 hours or beyond. And then to lose weight, ultimately, we're going to need to have less energy in than energy out. So we got to tip the energy balance. And really there, what we want to do is see that the body starts to be able to access the stored fat, right? We've got energy stored. So think of that big tank or fuel tank. We've got a lot of fuel in that tank, the big tank. So we don't really need to eat all the time because we can actually rely on that. But as long as insulin levels stay high and insulin resistance, we will not be able to lose that weight. And so this first step is really, you've got to have a strategy to eat to lower insulin. And with that strategy, insulin levels come down. And as insulin levels come down, we start to be able to burn fat. And then we start to be able to lose weight. So that's the first part of the 4+2 diabetes reversal strategy, eat to lower insulin. In the future sessions, we're going to go through the other components: use your muscles, be kind to your liver, restore fat burning, de-stress, and improve sleep. Want to leave you with some 101 behaviors. And so kind of the 101 behaviors for the eat to lower insulin are eat real foods. So these are the whole foods, right? Whole foods that come in the package they were grown in. So they're, the broccoli is not made in a factory; it's grown. If we're eating meat, we want to eat healthy, meat that's been raised in a natural fashion. And then think sugar equivalents, right? Think about how much sugar that food is going to convert into and what kind of sort of insulin response it's going to have. And so often if we just do the first thing, we actually don't need to think as much about the sugar equivalents. But it takes a while to do that. So think about the sugar equivalents and use the infographic that we've shared within the program to do that. The next steps really, for most people are focused on fiber, right? So as they make that shift, it's trying to be sure you're getting enough fiber and trying to be looking for more kind of fiber options within the meals that you're eating. So if you're not getting a lot of fiber, it often takes a while to build up to be able to eat more fiber. And part of that, I think, is just that you're going to have to change. The bacteria in your gut are going to have to change to allow you to tolerate more fiber. So if you went from 10 grams of fiber a day to 60 grams of fiber a day, I think you would pay for that in terms of gut symptoms. But doing this slowly over time is going to be a key thing. So that's it for this session. Please take time to do and look at kind of the exercises that are in the program. And we will come back in the next session with Use Your Muscles.